or does it still? Interesting. See, when I click record, my clicker no longer works. And then I go like that, and then it works. No idea why. Okay. All right. Chapter 7, designing organizational structures. This is kind of an abstract concept, right? It's something, really, this is something the executives do. Most of us have probably never been in a situation where we developed an organizational structure, but I think you will understand the concept and why it's important. Okay, I just fixed this and it broke again. I don't know what happened between standing here and walking over there. Works. Should still work. Okay. All right. So again, it's kind of an abstract concept. We'll look at what are the traditional forms of organizational structures. So we tend to have organizations that are structured like a pyramid. This is not the best example, but you can kind of see how there are fewer people at the top and a lot more people at the bottom. It's kind of a pyramid shape. And that is traditional because it works. Having one person in control or a small number of people in control helps focus all the decision making, right? And keep things organized. And then you've got lots and lots of people at lower levels that are basically workers. So that's a very common structure. But there are more contemporary structures that are more complex and are more decentralized in some cases, and sometimes more effective. So we'll talk about newer structures as well. We'll look at the role of teams in organizational structure. We'll look at some of the tools that organizations use to develop relationships, because that's really what this is all about, is relationships. Who reports to who, or maybe whom reports to whom, I'm not really sure. Which person is in charge of which department, right? It's all about relationships. Did you put your name on the list when you came in? I'll make sure to do that. We will, again, look at centralization versus decentralization, in this case, in terms of power and decision-making within the organization. We will compare mechanistic organizations, which are the traditional organizations that are structured somewhat like a machine, with organic organizations that are structured kind of more like a garden. They almost might seem random in the way that they are organized, but in some cases they work better than the traditional mechanistic approach. We'll look at what's called the informal organization. That is something that management does not really control. It just kind of emerges on its own, and the workers really get to create that informal organization. And then we'll look at traits. Okay, so again, it's very abstract, but pictures help us understand abstract concepts. Oh, if I just go back, actually, sorry, but let me zoom in. What we see here on the right is an organizational chart. For short, sometimes referred to as an org chart. So pretty much every organization has an org chart. And it helps in understanding what are the different positions within the organization. For example, we see this person here is the chairperson of, this is the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This person, at least at the time that this org chart was made, was the chairperson. These people were all commissioners. So it actually is kind of like a pyramid, because in a sense, the chairperson is on top, right? And then there are other people that work directly with the chairperson. And then you've got all these people underneath them. And then you've got a whole bunch of people underneath them. So it's really structured somewhat like a pyramid. And that works pretty well in many cases. And that's why it's very common to see that structure. Here is a similar organizational chart, but here we see not names and not pictures. We only see the job titles. So sometimes an org chart is this simple, where we see, obviously, there's a president. Now, who reports to the president in this particular organization? Yeah, there are 3 vice presidents, right? One is in charge of finance, one in charge of operations, and one in charge of marketing. How many people report to the finance vice president? 3, right? So it's very easy to see who reports to who. Again, it's all about relationships. And this makes sense because when you get a job, you want to know who your boss is. Why does it matter who your boss is? Why do you need to know that? Yeah. So you can let them know what you're doing. You can go to them if you need help. You can get instructions from them, right? It just makes sense, especially because your boss usually works in the same area that you do, right? So they know about your job because they oversee it, and maybe they used to do your job. So they can help you do better in that particular job, right? That's kind of the reason I teach business, because that's what my background, both in work and education, has been in. If this were a chemistry class, I would not be able to do a very good job teaching you because I never even took a chemistry course in my life. So I don't know much about chemistry, right? So it makes sense that the accounting manager reports to the finance vice president because those are closely related fields. Then here we've got the sales manager reporting to the marketing VP. Again, it makes sense because sales is part of marketing. So creating a structure like this is very logical. It's very effective. It's not perfect. You know, sometimes when we're so focused on just doing our job and supporting our department, we miss the bigger picture. And maybe the sales department ends up doing things that make the marketing person look good, but then the operations team gets mad at the marketing department because they're like, hey, we can't produce enough products to sell everything that you're selling to the customers, right? And then you get conflict. And as I mentioned earlier, conflicts can be a bad thing, but sometimes it's a good thing. If you can resolve that conflict and find a way to get the operations department to meet the needs of the marketing department, then that conflict turns into a good thing.
I have a question about.
Sure.
Can one person basically host finance, operation, and marketing?
Sure, especially in a small company.
So I was going to say, in Safeway, isn't that basically our store directors?
Yeah, could be. So that's a great example because that's a retail environment, right? A grocery chain is retail. And you do have somebody in charge of that store, right? So the person in charge of that store is kind of like the president for that one store, right? Because they're kind of overseeing everything. But now they might report to a regional person that's in charge of the entire region. And then the regional person might report to a national, person that's in charge of the entire nation. And they might report to somebody, not in Safeway's case, but if it were like Aldi or some other foreign-owned grocery chain, they might report to somebody in another country. So yeah, you can have multiple levels. And sometimes it is based on geography. In fact, we'll get back to that point in a couple minutes. Great point, DeAndre. Any other comments? Any other questions? So let's look. There are 5 traditional structures that organizations traditionally have used. Oh, actually, I forgot. I put these 2 slides in there first. Before we get to that, this is Hartnell College's organizational structure, which I thought might be useful because it's relevant, right? Because we're all here right now. So Hartnell College is overseen by a board of trustees. And these trustees are elected by the people that live everywhere from Castroville down to the southern border of the county, past King City. So you've got these 7 geographical regions of eastern Monterey County, where the local population elects that board of trustees. And actually those trustees don't really get paid a whole lot. I think they make about $2,000 a year. Not a lot of money. They're mainly doing it because they care about our college district. And those trustees, they come together at least monthly to make decisions. They get to decide who's the president and superintendent of Hartnell's district. And actually, in the 5 years I've been here, we've had 4 presidents. I think the one we have now is the one that's doing the best job, at least out of the last 3. And I hope he's going to be around for a long time. But if at some point he resigns, or if at some point he's not doing a good job, the board of trustees can replace him with somebody else. Now, you see that the president reports to the board of trustees. You have ASHC, Associated Students of Hartnell College. That is a student-run organization. That's where you as a student have a voice. You could serve on the ASHC, or you could go to the ASHC if you had concerns that you wanted to share or ideas, and they would represent you. They actually have a representative on the board of trustees. That person is not a voting member, but they do sit in on the meetings and get to share their opinions and the discussions. So there is a student represented on the board of trustees. You've got all these staff, which includes some union members and non-union members, also our custodial staff who are part of a different union. They are all the employees that work here who are not faculty members. But then you also have all the faculty members, both full-time and part-time, and they are represented also by a union. So we have 3 different unions on campus. We've got the Academic Senate with a whole bunch of different committees. We've got the Hartnell College Council with, again, a whole bunch of different committees. And all these different groups work together on their specific areas to make our college what it is. And it works pretty well. And sometimes it's frustrating because there is a lot of bureaucracy anytime you're dealing in a government agency, especially one as large as Hartnell College. I mean, we've got at least 10,000 students, hundreds and hundreds of employees. That's a pretty big organization, right? So it can be frustrating, but overall, it is fairly effective. This is another view of the structure of Hartnell College. So here you see the board of trustees and the interaction with all these different groups. We got the president's cabinet, the council. You can see how recommendations are made here in between these different groups, all these different councils. We have the community can show up at board of trustee meetings and share their opinions and ask questions, because this is a community college, right? So the community has a voice as well. And that would include some of our industry partners like Taylor Farms. They give a lot of money and other resources to the college, and in exchange, we help prepare people to go work for Taylor Farms. Everything revolves around the mission, vision, goals, and strategic plan. Does that sound familiar? Have I talked about strategy and mission, right? And Hartnell's mission is to serve the community, in terms of providing education and job opportunity. So you can see the complex structure that is Hartnell College, but you don't see it so much here, but it is sort of that it's sort of a pyramid structure with the board at top, and there is a chairperson of the board, but it is pretty complex. Okay. Are there any comments, any questions on anything so far? We will talk about the 5 traditional structures, and then I'll show you a video. So the first of these 5 traditional structures is by function. So imagine you started an organization. Initially, if you're the only person in the organization, you don't need a structure. It's all about you. But as you start hiring employees or independent contractors, you need to figure out who reports to who, right? And the bigger your organization, the more important that becomes. So as your organization grows, one way to divide up the organization is to say, okay, one person's in charge. Maybe that's you. And then you've got somebody in charge of all the legal issues, somebody else in charge of the human resources issues, somebody in charge of manufacturing, and so on. So in that case, you're dividing up the work by functional area, right? Engineering is a different function than marketing, which is a different function than finance. And then you would hire people in those areas that have those skills. And to some degree, that's what we have at Hartnell College. The faculty are one whole functional area. Admissions and records is a functional area. What else? The career hub is another functional area, right? They each serve a different function. So it makes sense to divide up your organization like that. But that's only one of the 5. The second approach, the second way you could divide up your organization would be by product. So the example here is a hospital. Imagine you run a hospital. How would you divide up the hospital? You might divide it up by the different service that gets provided in each area. So we've got the emergency room. If you, God forbid, have to go to the emergency room, do you want a pediatric care doctor who specializes in treating children to treat you? You're not a child, right? If you're male, do you want an OBGYN to come in and treat you? No, because you're male, right? So you want somebody that knows your particular medical issue. So it makes sense to divide up a hospital by the emergency room, pediatrics, cardiology, to deal with heart issues, and so on, right? That makes sense. Because they're specializing in whatever service or whatever area of medicine, they're providing. So that would be dividing up the organization by those different services. They're not physical products, but we'll see an example of physical products later on Wednesday. Does that make sense? Okay. You could also divide up your organization by the different processes that are done in the different areas. So if you ran a factory, right? A factory is sometimes referred to as a plant, okay? So if you ran a factory, you're the plant superintendent, you might have one group of people where they're really good at taking raw wood and cutting it into different shapes. So that's the process that they do. And then you've got another group where they take those pieces of wood and they assemble them together to furniture. And then you've got another group that finishes the furniture. They paint it or they stain it. And then you've got another group that ships out the furniture. So in this case, every group has a different process. This might be a logical way to divide up your organization by different processes. So we have 3 traditional approaches so far. Any questions? All right, so let's look at the 2 others. One by customer. If, let's say your company makes aerospace stuff, missiles, planes, rockets, things like that. So that's probably a bad example. Let's say engines. Engines, okay. You make engines. You might sell some engines to train companies. Some engines you sell to plane companies. Some you sell to car companies, and some you sell to the military, right? So it might make sense, even though it's kind of the same product, you divide up by who your customer is. Because the military might have certain requirements, like confidentiality, that some of the information is classified, right? And the railroad customers, maybe the way that you market to them is different, like, than the aircraft customers. I experienced this when I worked at AT&T Wireless back in the 90s. We had salespeople that would sell only to government agencies and other salespeople that would sell only to businesses. And then we even had in our stores people who would sell to consumers. So our marketing department was divided by customer type. Okay, so customer departmentalization would be another way to divide up your departments in your company, this time by customer. And then we get to DeAndre's point, I guess he stepped out, but you could also divide your organization geographically and say, okay, we've got a manager for Monterey County. They're in charge of all of the Safeways, for example, in Monterey County. And then they report to somebody who's in charge of all the Safeways in California. And they report to somebody who's in charge of all the Safeways in the country. So in this case, they're taking the organization and dividing it up geographically. Okay, so these are your 5 traditional organizational structures. You have functional, product, process, what else? We had customer and geographic. All right, questions? Okay. So the video I want to show you now is about how to start a movement. It's kind of a short video, and it is a little shaky. Like as you watch it visually, part of it is shaky. If that bothers you, please look away. Okay, I don't want it to cause any issues for anybody. But the reason I want to show it to you, it's really interesting. It's about how the leader of an organization, who's often the person that's at the top, right? Like if we go back to this type of structure, the leader is important, but they have to have followers. Because if you don't have any followers, you're not a leader, right? Just today, I was talking to somebody I know who he's in Spain, and I've only met him within the last year. I don't know him that well, but we had set up this meeting for today, and I looked on his LinkedIn profile. LinkedIn is the primary social media site for professionals. That I think I've recommended everybody here should have a LinkedIn profile at some point, so you might create one if you don't have one. But I looked on his LinkedIn profile. He has 21,000 followers on LinkedIn, which is crazy because it's not like Instagram or something where people follow just because it's fun or it's cool. This is professional people for some reason are so interested in what he's doing, they follow him on LinkedIn. Coolest guy, very smart, but my point is, you don't have any followers, you're not a leader. Who are you leading if nobody's following you, right? And so that's the video I'm going to show you. It's all about the role, especially of the first follower, right? If you're going to start an organization, the first person that says, hey, I believe in what you're doing and I'm going to help you, they play a critical role. Because without that person, again, you're not a leader. So let's watch the video.
Okay. we don't necessarily have that Safeway at all. No,
Let's say if I.
And just in the Punda one, most of the people over there sound miserable. People
Okay.
quit, they just don't care.
Well, that's an interesting comparison. So from DeAndre's experience, his organization, people don't care about their work. People don't sound happy. Whereas from what we see here at Zappos, people seem pretty happy. And they seem to care about what they do.
But the only reason why is mainly probably because of management.
Okay,
If you have a good manager, well-established manager,
okay.
bring positive and if you get work environment.
A manager can make all the difference, right? A great manager can motivate you. Goes at the top, starts at the top. And so isn't it interesting that Zappos got rid of management?
And also, I feel like it makes the company run more productive. Like, I don't know if you guys been to like CVS or Walmart. Sometimes they, like, I went to Walmart, the electronic guy took like 30 minutes for them to open something. And then CVS too, I tried to open something, they didn't come.
Okay, right, yeah, customer service can be terrible, right? In some organizations, that sometimes I worked for 10 years in customer service. And now I just get so frustrated with organizations that they only allow you sometimes to get service through their website or through email, and then they don't respond and they don't fix your problem. And you're like, do you want me as a customer or not? That's right. Did you hear what they were saying? There was a customer service rep at Zappos who spent 10 hours on a call with a customer. And most companies, they'd be fired for doing that, right? But he said it's a fantastic thing that the customer and the employee bonded. And he didn't even know what they talked about. He didn't care. But the fact that there was that much value that the customer wanted to spend that much time talking to a Zappos employee. Very, very different approach to business and management in general, but it's including how the organization is developed, it's structured. Did you remember they showed the team that was having a meeting and they were talking about different things? And there was somebody facilitating that discussion, but there was no manager in that group. Everybody had their role, came together as a team to solve problems and make decisions together. So any other observations about this video, the earlier video, about leadership, followers, any other questions or comments?
I think there's got to be some kind of a management system because regardless, let's say, of how many employees they have, if somebody doesn't pull their weight or they're not doing their duties, either that employee gets reprimanded or is going to oversee that employee.
Exactly.
Is getting these things done or not.
Exactly. So what Zappos had to do is say, okay, if we're not going to have managers here in between, whoever's running the organization from an executive level and the workers, we're going to take out that management in the middle. What are the different job functions that management has to do? And can we divide those jobs up? So somebody's in charge of holding others accountable, somebody makes the schedule, somebody does the training, right? How do we then distribute that work? How do we decentralize it away from the managers? Did you have a comment?
Well, I was gonna say, is it like the group cycle to manage what other groups do?
It's possible, yeah. A team can hold itself accountable and each other accountable, and maybe even hold other teams accountable. So there are ways to do it, right? It just takes some creativity. It doesn't work in every organization. But Zappos is a multi-billion-dollar company. Another one that I believe is mentioned in the textbook, in fact, I'm sure it is W.L. Gore and Associates. I'm not positive it's in this chapter, but there is a case study on W.L. Gore and Associates, also a multi-billion-dollar company that doesn't have managers. And in fact, at that company, when you get hired, they don't even tell you what your job is. And you get to decide what job you're going to do after they've hired you. So that's a pretty creative and unusual approach to management, but for some companies, it works. All right. So let's cover a couple more slides. We'll talk about contemporary organizational structures, and then we will do our video discussion activity. Oh, okay. Actually, this is not a contemporary structure. This is just a way to look at different positions in the company. You will sometimes, sorry, this is cut off, but it says line functions and staff functions. So that is a concept you'll come across in the business world, that there are line positions and staff positions. And the way to think about that, if you are involved in making the product or providing the service, that is a line position. Because the company does not exist if it doesn't have a product or a service, right? So think about like a company that makes cars and they've got an assembly line and people are working on that assembly line. They're directly involved with making the product. So line positions are directly involved in providing the product or service. Staff functions are support. Things like accounting and human resources. They're not making the product, they're not providing the service, but they're supporting the overall organization, okay? So that's one way to think about organizational structure. But by itself, it's not really a structure. It's just a way to understand those two different types of jobs. Some people earlier mentioned this term, the division of labor. So it used to be back in ye olden days, for example, if you had a blacksmith that made horseshoes, they probably worked primarily by themselves. Maybe they had a couple helpers, but they would go and they'd get the iron ore and they would smelt it down. They make it really hot and then they could shape it into the horseshoe shape, and that's what they did. And so they basically knew the entire process. And with the exception of having some helpers, maybe an apprentice or something like that, they did everything. But that's not very efficient. Imagine you worked at a restaurant and there are 100 people there, hungry people, and you need to cook for all of them. It's going to be a nightmare, right? On the other hand, if you had a team and you could say, okay, here's the menu, this is what we're making today. You make the salads, you make the soups, you make the entree, you make the dessert. If you're dividing up the work into different tasks, and people are trained in those areas, it's going to be much more efficient. And that is the concept of the division of labor. I might have mentioned in the past Adam Smith. I think in the chapter when we talked about economics, I mentioned him. He was a Scottish philosopher, but he also really is considered sort of the father of economics. And in fact, when the United States became a country, a lot of how we were structured economically was based on Adam Smith's writings. And one thing that Smith wrote about was the division of labor. And he said, okay, if you've got a bunch of people working, instead of everybody doing everything, if instead everybody does a specific job and they just keep doing that job over and over, it's a lot more efficient. If you divide up the labor, let's see what's going on here. We've got some people, I don't know, they're like leaving. I'm not even sure what they're doing. You've got somebody else here managing the fire. Somebody else looks like they're making yarn. This guy's got a bucket of something. They're each doing something different. And by doing that same task repeatedly, it's much more efficient. They get better at it. They get faster. And so dividing labor, Smith was able to prove mathematically that it makes us more efficient. And that's why in these organizational structures we've seen, you divide it up. You've got people in charge of marketing, people in charge of manufacturing, people in charge of finance. And then within that, you've got different specializations, right? So that's what the division of labor is. Dividing up work into different tasks. Okay, we'll cover one contemporary structure because I did tell you we would cover 3 slides, so I'll stick to my word. This is one contemporary organizational structure. Notice that at the top, it kind of looks like the functional structure we saw earlier. So we've got somebody in charge of research, somebody in charge of sales, engineering, and so on, right? Those are different functional areas. But notice that this is not a pyramid shape, more like a rectangle. Or actually, it's a matrix. In the matrix, you've got rows and you've got columns. And that's what we have here. So this structure is a little different because this scientist reports to the vice president of research, but they also report to a project manager for the project that they're working on. So they've got one boss that's in the same functional area as them, but then they've got another boss that's overseeing the whole project they're working on. So on this project, you've got a scientist, a sales rep, an engineer, people from different areas all working on that project. So it makes sense for them to report to a project manager in addition to their functional manager. This is called the matrix structure. Now imagine that instead of one boss, you have 2 bosses. What would that be like? Conflict. What if this boss is telling you one thing and this boss is telling you something else? But remember, conflict can be good. It's normal for this boss to be focused on research and this one to be focused on the project. So they're going to have different priorities. But everything should support the overall vision and strategy and mission, right? So that means it forces you as a scientist to kind of mediate between your bosses and get them to work together and try to find a way to make everybody happy. So the matrix structure can be challenging, it can be frustrating, it can be time consuming, but it can lead to better outcomes because it forces people to work together. That is the essence of a matrix structure. From my experience, you don't really find this that often, but it works really well in companies that do a lot of special projects where you've got all these different projects, and so you have to have somebody in charge of each one. Or think about like a company that makes airplanes. So they've got all these different functional areas, but they've got one person in charge of Boeing's, or maybe not Boeing, but like Alaska Airlines order, and another person in charge of the United Airlines order. So you end up with these different project managers in those scenarios. Or construction would be another one. Got a construction company, they're building a house over here, they're building a bridge over there. Each of these is a different project. So then it makes sense to use this kind of matrix structure. All right, so I promised I would stop talking here for a while. Any questions, any comments before you do your video activity, your video discussion? All right, so go ahead and find your groups. Try to have at least 4 people in a group, and we'll take about 8 minutes for you to come up with your group questions. Contemporary organizational structures. Now, we learned that at Zappos, because they got rid of management, they had to rely more on teams, right? And a committee is one type of a team. A committee typically has people from different parts of the organization working together for a specific purpose. Like, I'll give you an example. Recently, there's a job opening that came up here on campus that happens all the time. And we try to have at least one faculty member involved whenever we're filling a new position, even if it's not a faculty position. So in this particular situation, the job was not for a faculty member, but they wanted a faculty member on the committee, and I volunteered, and so I've been working with this committee. We've been looking at the applicants, looking at their resumes, their applications, and deciding which ones are coming in for an interview, and then we'll actually interview them and decide which ones we're going to recommend. So this committee, made up of people from different parts of the organization, are coming together for this particular purpose. And then once the job is done, then that committee won't exist anymore. Now, when you've got a group of people coming together for a specific purpose, you're going to have different perspectives, right? You're going to have people with different skill sets and different knowledge and ideas. Again, conflict can arise, but out of that conflict, if it's managed effectively, you'll probably make a better decision. I think at one point we talked about the decision-making process. Do you all remember that? I think it was during the chapter on management and leadership. And we talked about how you can make decisions individually, but sometimes it makes sense to make decisions as a group, democratic leadership. And it takes longer, but you get everybody's perspectives, and generally you will then make a better decision. Because even the leader is not necessarily an expert on everything. And I've seen this so many times that when you seek out the input of others, you make a better decision. I see this over and over. So when you have a committee, you have all these different perspectives, conflicting ideas. If that conflict is managed effectively, it leads to a better result. If you end up with fist fights, or people yelling at each other, or people just quitting the committee because they're not getting along, well, that's not good, right? So how do you do that? How do you get a group of people with diverse perspectives who maybe don't even like each other to work together effectively?
Gotta be open-minded and be willing to make some changes.
Okay? Everybody on the team has to be open-minded. You have to be listening to others' perspectives, listening to others' facts, because what they think is a fact might be different from what you think is a fact. Ismail?
Have a mediator.
Maybe having somebody that's kind of the referee and the facilitator. Some groups can function okay without a specific facilitator, but it is, with a team that doesn't quite have that ability, it is useful to have a trained facilitator. What should that facilitator do? If you were in charge of facilitating a group discussion, what are some things you could do to try to make sure the group came to a good decision? Okay, so votes can be useful because then you figure out what the majority wants or believes. It's even better if you can get to a point where everybody comes to the same conclusion, but sometimes that doesn't happen. Right? That would be unanimous. If everybody agrees on the same thing, it's unanimous. If you come up with a decision that everybody can support, even though maybe it's not their first choice, anybody know what that's called? That's called consensus. So think of it this way: unanimous is everybody agrees. Consensus is we came up with something that we can all support. And then if you can't get there, if you can't get to consensus, yeah, taking a vote and going with the majority, at least that's a democratic approach. Right? What else would be important in that process of trying to get there, trying to reach at least a consensus, if not a unanimous decision? What else can the facilitator do? You remember when I talked about the brainstorming process? Where you have a period of just people throwing out ideas? Do you remember what I said was critical during that brainstorming process?
Culture.
Culture, yeah, it is a certain culture, but it's not to criticize. During that time, every idea is acceptable. Even if it's a dumb idea, it's okay, just put it out there. We're not gonna criticize it. We're just gonna see what other ideas it sparks, right? And another key component is that the facilitator needs to make sure we hear from every person. Because in every group, there are gonna be some loud voices and there are gonna be some quiet voices. So if we were trying to make a decision and I were facilitating, I'd make sure every single person here not only had the opportunity, but was actually asked for their perspective. Because sometimes the person that sits back and doesn't say anything has the best idea. And the facilitator can draw that out. Are you gonna say something this time?
Like the guy in the video,
Which one?
the one that at the end of the group activity or.
Yeah, yeah. And he was doing a good job of making sure that everybody got to say something. I mean, we didn't see the whole discussion, but it seemed like he was doing that. Any comments or questions there? So we'll end with this slide. The strengths and weaknesses of group decision making. I've kind of already touched on this. When you make decisions as a group, it's going to take longer. Right? Because you need time for everybody's perspectives and for the brainstorming and the clarification, discussion. But you get a diversity of perspectives and you tend to come up with a better decision as long as everybody participates. If you're in a hurry, you might not have time for a group discussion. And that's when sometimes the boss just needs to make a decision on their own, right? So there are both pros and cons in the group decision-making process. All right, any comments, any questions? Okay, well, we'll end it there. I'll see you all on Wednesday.